Now, without further ado, I want to welcome onto the program our guest this week. He is an author. He is an analyst, a longtime Middle East correspondent. His name is Elijah Magnier. He's joining us right now. Elijah, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Elijah, suffice to say, there's a lot going on, and it's moving extremely rapidly right now in the Middle East. And this latest phase of escalation, you could say, well, of course, it began a very long time ago. Many things have happened, but just in the last couple of weeks, Israel striking the Iranian embassy in Damascus and really crossing a red line internationally. This, of course, is in violation of the Vienna Conventions. This is sort of a sacrosanct area, isn't it? Embassies and diplomatic facilities, but Israel's crossed the line here. There's a lot of people guessing as to why they did that. Elijah, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and then just how you see the current situation in general. We spoke before about the horrific situation in Gaza, and it's kind of led us to this point right now, where we are literally on the precipice of potentially a wider war. And I don't think anybody wants to see that, but it looks like it's a possibility, as horrific as that might be, even to make that statement, Elijah. It's very much a clear and present danger. What are your feelings right now over the last week or so, last couple of weeks?
You're absolutely right. Nobody wants a wider war except Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is why he went to Syria to bomb an Iranian consulate protected by diplomatic immunity. The reason why Benjamin Netanyahu wants or wishes for a wider war where the Americans are involved in it is because he is in deep crisis. Domestically, he is facing opposition, not big enough for him to remove him, but a constant opposition from the leftists, or what so-called leftists, because there aren't any leftists really in Israel. They're all right-wing, but they call themselves leftists. We're talking about Yair Lapid, who invited Benjamin Netanyahu to step down for an early election and promised to support him. Also, Benny Gantz, who is in the war cabinet, a minister, and again, he is the one who is getting the largest support of the Knesset, with more or less 35 votes of the Knesset among 120, who is also competing with Benjamin Netanyahu and asking him for an early election, and this is not something that he wants to do. Again, all the military and other politicians, apart from the far right wing, we're talking about the duo, the security minister Ben Gvir and the finance minister Smotrich, who are the reason why Netanyahu is still in power, who enjoy the majority in the Knesset, and he is the reason why they are in power in his cabinet. So this small group that represent the majority in the Knesset wants the war to continue for different reasons. The Smotrich Ben Gvir want the war to continue because they want to remove all the Palestinians from Gaza and eventually from the West Bank, and they want the return of the settlers to Gaza. And they don't want to stop the war. They reject any ceasefire, any permanent ceasefire. What they agree on, a lasting ceasefire, which is a temporary ceasefire that can be broken if the two sides don't agree on all the terms that they are negotiating around the table. So this is something that the far right would agree with, but not Netanyahu and not this group, because if they stop the war and they accept the terms of the Palestinian negotiators, it means the Israelis are going toward an early election. And that means Netanyahu will step down, notwithstanding the promise of Yair Lapid in the opposition, because he doesn't trust him and because a coalition with the opposition cannot last for very long. So for him, he has failed to achieve any of his stated objectives to defeat Hamas. He has failed to eliminate Hamas and free the prisoners and the hostages, because there are civilians and military. And the only thing he has managed tactically is to destroy most of Gaza and to kill 33 to 35,000 Palestinians, with 6 to 8,000 under the rubble and wounded 75,000. He has managed to destroy 70 to 80% of Gaza, but that is not a strategic victory, because houses can be rebuilt, people can have more children in the future. There are already 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, and the loss of life is important. However, this is not a victory because Hamas is still operating. If we hear what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, he said that he killed 19,000 of Hamas members. Assume that what he's saying is right, even if it is not. There are 5 resistant groups in Gaza. He has estimated Hamas between 40 to 60,000, which means he has managed to kill a third. That's a total failure. So his only hope is to bring the United States in a war where the Americans, with very little appetite to go to war because they are facing a presidential election, will ask Netanyahu to step down or to stop the war at the cost of stopping all the supply of weapons. Then Benjamin Netanyahu can say, well, it is not my fault. I want to continue and win this war, but the Americans threatened me, and hence I have to stop this war. That is the excuse that he can give to his coalition in the government. And this is one of the main reasons he went to bomb the Iranian consulate, because just a few weeks before, he killed one of the highest IRGC general in his farm in the outskirts of Damascus, and Iran did not retaliate because it was not protected by diplomatic immunity, even if all the Iranian advisors came to Syria under the request of the Syrian government. That was not an Iranian territory. What he did, regardless the 7 high-ranking officers, of which one is the highest and he's second in command, i.e. the Brigadier General Zahedi and General Rahimi, he destroyed a consulate. And that is why the Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, who is the leader of the revolution, said, our men, we have brave men who are going to punish Israel. And the key is this word, how Iran is going to punish Israel.
So this is quite a gamble on the Israeli side. I mean, this is a chess match, but one it carries with it very high risks, because they're basically anticipating that they'll be able to somehow control the ladder of escalation, as it were, and that everything. If you're right, Elijah, if Israel was winning the war, if they were achieving their military objectives, if they had achieved everything that they set out for, there wouldn't be a need to provoke Iran in order to draw the United States in. So in your estimation, is this the main motivation of the strike on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, was to create a chain of events that could draw the U.S. Deeper into confrontation with Iran?
Yes. So what the Americans did is they've sent in secret 4 letters to Iran. And in these 4 letters, they always asked Iran to refrain from enlarging the war. And this is one of the reasons why the Iraqi resistance stopped attacking American objectives in Iraq, but not in Syria, and not attacking the Israelis in support of Gaza. And because the Iranians accepted the American offer that they will do their best to stop the Israelis from enlarging the war and to try to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, which is not something they've done in the last 7 months, but only in the last few weeks. This is why Iran consider now the Americans have violated the deal. They have violated all the promises they have done through their letters sent to Iran indirectly through mediators, i.e. Oman in this case, and they did not respect their words. And because of that, because Benjamin Netanyahu went to hit Iran directly, then Iran went to the United Nations. Iran was hoping that at the United Nations, everything could be solved. And for Iran, it was not necessary to retaliate against Israel and shift the attention away from the Palestinian cause had the United Nations Security Council condemned and punished Israel, not only condemning, but also punishing. Unfortunately, the Americans, the British, and the French used the veto and opposed the punishing of Israel or even the condemnation at the United Nations Security Council. In this case, Iran sent a message through Oman and the embassy in Tehran that belonged to the Swiss, who hold the interests of the Americans, that in this case, we are going to retaliate directly against the Israelis. Now, if we put ourselves in the position of Benjamin Netanyahu, he has two options. First, the Iranians don't retaliate, and this is what he hoped for. Then he can continue bombing the embassy, ambassadors, anywhere in the world, not only in Damascus. And then he can expand and prove and show to the people of Israel that he is the strong leader they need. He is even better than the person who created Israel as a state, David Ben-Gurion, because he is in power more than David Ben-Gurion, and he's offering more security, and he dares to stand and challenge the US, but also is killing the Iranians in their consulate. This is one of the options that Benjamin Netanyahu had. The second option for Benjamin Netanyahu is Iran will retaliate directly against Israel, and then the war is enlarged. Or Iranian allies, i.e. Hezbollah, this is the strongest Iranian ally, will retaliate, and then he can start bombing Lebanon. And by bombing Lebanon, he will obtain exactly the same results, because this is when the Americans will interfere and say, no, you have to stop, because we can't stomach a second war, either against Iran or Lebanon, and we are not going to supply you with enough ammunition, because Israel cannot go to war without enough ammunition. And we've seen in 2006, for example, after 2 weeks, the Israelis started to scream for more ammunition, and the Americans opened up the base of the strategic warehouses they have in Israel and delivered their ammunition to the Israelis. Apart from they have brought more ammunition through Ireland and through other means, and to support the war in 2006. They've done exactly the same this time and supported Israel. But they are not going to support the second war. So on all fronts, Benjamin Netanyahu is a winner, unless Iran bomb Israel and all the interception missiles of the Israelis, plus the one of NATO that are already deployed in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean, waiting, including with the Israeli interception missiles. So we're talking about the Iron Dome, the Arrow 2, Arrow 3, we're talking about the David Slang, we're talking about the Patriot, and we're talking about NATO interception missile systems. If they all work together and manage to intercept, let's say, between 50 to 70, 80%, this is where the Iranians will be satisfied, because they've done the retaliation. It is not important what is the damage these missiles are going to create. What is important to send a message that we are retaliating, and you cannot hit a consulate with impunity, and you will be held accountable. Now, if missiles manage to go through, this is where the Americans need to evaluate and interfere to stop the tit for tat on both sides, because then the situation will escalate and other allies of Iran will be part of the war. And the first retaliation, nobody but Iran is expected to take the first step. Now, there is another thing that I didn't mention. In April 2021, when the Israelis sabotaged the Natanz nuclear facility, and they were responsible for it, Iran retaliated by increasing the enriched uranium from 20% to 60%. That was a major hit to the Israeli and to the American national security. This is also a form of retaliation that Iran did at that time. But from the preparation that the American satellites and the Western satellite and the Israelis are seeing on the ground in Iran, where Iran is protecting more than 91 military and nuclear sites with all interception missiles and anti-air missiles, it indicates that Iran is ready to retaliate by missiles and drones. Now, the only person who knows the answer is Sayyid Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme commander of all the armed forces in Iran, including the IRGC. So it is not the president, it is not the speaker, it is no foreign minister or anyone who knows the form of the retaliation, the time of the retaliation, and how this is going to take shape, and if a second retaliation is going to be needed depending on the consequences of the first.
And as you said earlier, Elijah, this whole scenario has almost succeeded, and the more it escalates, it'll even succeed even more in diverting attention away from the Palestinian issue, away from the horrors of Gaza, away from the genocide, and onto this new paradigm, which will be basically the United States and Israel versus Iran and its allies. Hezbollah will more than likely is thrown into that mix. But you have these two political dimensions with Netanyahu. On one hand, as you said, his legacy. This is probably the most important thing for him personally, and for what he believes he's doing for the future of Israel, getting his deliverables. But the United States, there's a big push right now to call for his ouster, because in Washington, it seems like they believe that they could kind of get rid of a pressure release valve, if you will, get rid of a lot of the bad will by getting rid of Netanyahu and then changing the narrative that way, resetting the narrative, because this has been hugely embarrassing for the Biden administration, the full flag and support of Israel since the beginning of this. So you've got these two dimensions on the Washington side and the Israeli side of Netanyahu's leadership. Which one will prevail?
I think the Americans and the Israelis have the same objectives. The only thing, it is the time of this attack that doesn't suit the Joe Biden administration, because it coincides with the presidential election. Now, we have seen the ultimate support that the Americans brought to Israel immediately after the first week of the 7th of October, giving Israel the free hand to do whatever he wants in Gaza. That was because they both meet on the same objectives: to eliminate the Palestinians, to kill as many Palestinians as possible, and to do whatever the Israelis want to do as an act of revenge. The only thing that were unforeseen by both sides, the Americans and the Israelis, are two things. First, that the Israeli army would fail to achieve the objectives in a short time. Second, it's the size of the civilians killed in this war, the type of war that is include the starvation, cutting aid from coming into Gaza, cutting water, electricity, committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing by moving the population from the north to the south, and then from the south to Rafah, and then bomb them in the south and then in Rafah, and the reaction of the population worldwide. These 2 points were unforeseen by the American administration, who started to see results in the more or less 5 to 6 to 7 states in America who are Democrats, but will not vote for Joe Biden for what he has done in giving free hand to the crimes of Benjamin Netanyahu and his army. Because of that, the Americans are starting to talk about more pressure on the 7th month. So after Joe Biden came out The first time he denied, and the second time he confirmed. The second time, Joe Biden, with his words, said there are 30,000 civilians killed in Gaza. If these figures are right or wrong coming from Palestinians, they come from the President of the United States. And he said there are many civilians, and this is unacceptable. However, he has done nothing to stop the killing, because after his 30,000, the clock did not stop. The clock continued ticking. And now the number are 35,500 plus. So after what Joe Biden came out, he continues supplying weapons to Israel. They do not agree on killing Hamas. They do not agree on killing further Palestinians and consider the civilians collateral damage. What the difference is created now between the Americans and the Israelis is the Americans consider the Israelis' objectives are no longer realistic. So the Israelis are saying we finish of the north, and now we start in Khan Yunis, Hamad, Nusayrat in the south. And then they return to the north because they see Hamas is attacking them from the north and sending missiles and rockets to the settlements in the Gaza envelope, around Gaza. And then they return to the north. And then they say, we finished the operation in the south. And then they pull out to the limit of Gaza, because this is what is requested of them in the first step of the negotiation, to pull out from the cities, not to pull out from all the Gaza Strip. This is according to the negotiation. But the way they do, they return again to the south. So they have not achieved their objectives. They have, according to Netanyahu, killed 19,000, which means a third of Hamas. I don't think the Americans have the patience, and the world can accept for Benjamin Netanyahu to go for another twice 7 months to continue killing the 2/3 remaining of Hamas without any guarantee of success. That is the difference, and this is the core of the fight between the Americans and the Israelis. When the Americans, from day one, Joe Biden said it in Tel Aviv, don't put objective that you cannot reach. And Benjamin Netanyahu put the limit extremely high by saying, I want to destroy Hamas and free the prisoners and the hostages. Well, he failed. And this is why Haaretz newspaper is coming out with an article saying, we have been defeated. That is an acknowledgement of the Israelis that Benjamin Netanyahu refused, and that Joe Biden can see with all his administration and all the club of the Western countries. That is the core of the dispute between the two administrations, not about the number of civilians killed and not about the starvation, because the Americans are still not managing to opening the north, to opening the Erez crossing, or to allow the Ashdod harbor to function as Benjamin Netanyahu promised. So still we have a better fed Palestinian, not enough, in the south, and starving Palestinian in the north, with both the north and the south deprived of water and electricity.
Yeah, and we also have this gaslighting that's going on in the media, where everything you just described, it's all, the conversation's all on the Israeli side. In other words, Israel needs to get its hostages released, not a mention at all about the thousands and the increasing number of Palestinians being placed in arbitrary detention in the various military courts and gulags or throughout occupied Palestine. Not a mention of that. And that's an important part, because this is an important negotiation point that Hamas has put forward from the beginning, and it's not even acknowledged in the press or in the conversation in the West. So there's that kind of gaslighting. The other gaslighting is back to the embassy being struck in Damascus. The headlines for the last week have been Iran is going to attack Israel, preparing for Iran's attack on Israel. And it's really a retaliation. It should be viewed as a retaliation, but that's not how it's being framed in the media. So we're against a big propaganda machine. And there's no, my fear, Elijah, is there's no limit as to how they can stretch this propaganda. For instance, the If anything, it happens with Hezbollah or is blamed on Hezbollah in this current tense environment, or anything like that related to, associated with, blamed on accusations, it will immediately be attached to Iran. And it will be used in Washington as a trigger for some massive military mobilization. I mean, I know how senators and congressmen have been hawkish over the years. They're just waiting. They're waiting for that spark. And this is the really dangerous part from here on the U.S. side that I see. Your thoughts on this?
I absolutely agree with you. This is an excellent point. This is why, from the very beginning, Hezbollah and Yemen said we are supporting the front of Gaza. We're not taking the war on us, even if Hezbollah is facing a war, but it is a controlled war, because the focus should remain on Gaza and the West Bank, which is something that you beautifully highlighted now, and that is omitted in the mainstream media. Now, this is again the challenge that Iran has in its retaliation to make sure that the attention is not going to shift away from Gaza and the Palestinian cause. But it is not only in the US, it's everywhere around the world. People are standing for Palestine because this is a conflict that has been going on since 1930 and was really reached its peak in 1948 with the exodus and the massacres of the Palestinians, villages, and the birth of Israel as a recognized state by the United Nations. Since then until today, people are aware of what's happening to the Palestinians. They are aware of their right of self-determination according to the United Nations Charter. They are aware of their self-defense right according to Article 51 of the UN Charter. They are aware of their right to return according to the UN Security Council also. So all the rights and all the legal aspect of international law support the Palestinian cause. And as you rightly said, this is not going to be the case when the war is going to shift between Israel and Hezbollah or Israel and Iran. And this is why Hezbollah refrained from the first beginning of the war to be pulled out where Israel wanted to enlarge the war. Every time Israel will hit objectives inland, in area that is not supposed to abide by along the Lebanese borders or along the Lebanese blue line, let's say, this is where Hezbollah we push the Israelis to limit the bombardment. And I think, as you put it, Iran is today thinking about the way to retaliate where the attention will not shift away from Gaza and will remain on the Palestinian cause, will remain enjoying the world population of a just cause. Not because people are standing with Palestine, no. People are standing against injustice because injustice can hit us all. And today it is hitting us, particularly in Europe, where no Israeli flag can be burned. You can burn a British flag, but you go to jail if you burn an Israeli flag. If a foreigner wants a German nationality, he needs to swear loyalty to the state of Israel in Germany. So you can understand today in France, for example, there is a total blackout on what's happening in Gaza. The clock stopped on the 7th of October. So this is, again, a challenge for Iran and for its allies to contain the retaliation, because the war is not conducted on social media to please the Twitterati. It is conducted on thoughtful retaliation to the point where the Israelis get the message, and then the war is always concentrated on what's happening in Gaza and on Palestine, and only on Palestine.
Yeah, and then, following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes back in January 2020, Iran waited. They waited for the time of their choosing, the targets of their choosing, very strategically hitting two military or two facilities, one in Iraq, and one, I believe, in Iraqi Kurdistan, if I'm not mistaken, at the time. But the U.S. did not respond after that, and that was I think, a sea change in Iran-U.S. Strategic relations. And I think it's because, my personal opinion, Elijah, is that U.S. doesn't have a strong strategic position in the Middle East. Now that Iran has risen as a regional power, has great capabilities in terms of missile capabilities and so forth, drones, etc., anti-aircraft, anti-missile. So that's, the playing field has changed. So if that's the case, if the U.S. If there is escalation with Iran, the U.S. doesn't appear to be in a very good position to manage this type of a conflict with a country like Iran and its allies. So certainly that should be the calculus in Washington, is to avoid at all costs this type of an escalation. That's what we're saying. Maybe that makes sense logically and rationally. Is this, however, the prevailing thinking in Washington? That's my worry, Elijah, is I don't know what they're thinking and what they believe that they can do if things do get out of hand.
I fully agree. The Americans are aware, through their experience in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. In Afghanistan, they went to fight the Taliban. They removed the Taliban. And after 20 years, they gave back the power to the Taliban. In Iraq, they have failed. And in Syria, they have failed to create a failed state. So for them, they are fully aware that they can start a war, but they can't end it in the way they want. And if we are only a few months away from the presidential election in November 2024, I don't think that the Americans will start a war with Iran where the word end is not in the hand of the Americans. And this is fully acknowledged by every single intelligent people in America. And there are many intelligent people, regardless their lack of full knowledge of what's happening in West Asia, and in particularly in Iran. This is why it is very unlikely that the Americans will allow a large war and will fall into the hand of Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is why everybody, at the exception of Israel, is thinking carefully how to retaliate, where to retaliate, and the shape that this retaliation is not going to provoke an all-out war. It is a very delicate situation where the Americans never said we are going to retaliate against Iran if Iran retaliates against Israel. They said we're going to protect Israel. Well, they can protect Israel as much as they want. They can deploy all their interception missiles and say to the Israelis, okay, you've bombed their consulate, they bomb you back, no harm, limited damage, as you rightly mentioned, the January 2020, when the Americans, President Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo decided to assassinate General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes. And the Americans said, okay, well, we stop there. We have 100 or 110 soldiers with a headache, and that is an acceptable consequences of what we have done. And I think the Americans will put everything on the table against the Israelis if Netanyahu thinks of retaliating. And I don't think anyone in Israel today is talking about a larger war where the economy is on the ground, the reservists are called to mobilization, and they've been at war for the last 7 months. The consequences of this war has been devastating to Israel, on the point where many Israelis, hundreds of thousands, fled the country. There are hundreds of thousands internally displaced. Any Israeli leader would not want to start another war, either with Iran or with Hezbollah. And this is why enlarging the war, even if it serves one man is going to drag the Americans, the Israelis, and all the Middle East into a wider war. I don't think the Americans will permit that.
Yeah, it doesn't play out when you sort of game out the various scenarios for this. It just doesn't play out well for Israel either way you go on this. But back to the bigger picture, Elijah. After Israel destroyed or attacked, fired a missile at Iranian embassy in Damascus, and if all countries can agree that this is a major red line to cross, if the UN Security Council would convene and jointly condemn this action by Israel, wouldn't that go somewhat of the way in terms of bringing the tension down? In other words, would Tehran read that as a positive result? Because to have a UN Security Council resolution against Israel for something that's a pretty easy slam dunk in terms of international law, how would Tehran accept that as a potential to pause or, delay escalation? What do you think?
That was one of the messages that the Iranians conveyed to the Americans, saying we will go to the United Nations Security Council. And had that been solved, where the United Nations Security Council would have condemned Israel and imposed sanctions on Israel, Iran doesn't need to retaliate. And this is what the Iranian diplomatic mission at the United Nations tweeted and responded to that. So because of the failure of the Americans to allow the resolution to go through, because the Americans continue supporting Israel in their action and did not condemn, nobody condemned in the West Israel apart from Norway and Arab countries and Latin American countries, a few countries in Africa, but in the West, no, the British, the French, and the American voted against. The German did not apologize, but what they did, they phoned Iranian Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian asking to de-escalate, and Amir Abdullahian answered that you need to tell your friend to stop attacking a diplomatic mission, and this is where everything has started. And the German did not condemn the Israeli violation of international laws. So yes, you're right. That would have been the perfect scenario where everything would have been de-escalated, and the Iranians would have been very happy, and the Israelis would receive their lesson, even if sanctions may not be applicable by many countries, but it is a moral victory for Iran. Even that, the Americans were not ready to give it. But perhaps the Americans are not very angry, or would not be very disappointed to see the Israelis getting their lesson from Iran, if this lesson is affordable and acceptable by the Israelis.
It just seemed like that was an open door and a great opportunity. But it's, as you said, Elijah, it's just politically a bridge too far for Washington to allow Israel to lose face on the world stage that way. They're still very much tied to Israel very tightly, but it's just become a sort of anvil around the ankle of the United States government, and it's certainly bringing down the Biden administration. This unconditional support for Israel and everything that it's done. They've been covering for them. They've been making excuses for them. They've been doing joint propaganda with them ever since October 7th. And I don't think it's benefited the U.S. at all. In fact, it's put them in a very bad position internationally, diplomatically, with their allies, potential allies, associate countries. It's not. I don't think it's going to end well. I don't think this can be turned around, because the reputation of Israel internationally is permanently damaged. I think we can all see this now. Even its staunch defenders are backpedaling now. Some of the people you'd never expect to be backpedaling and reconsidering their position, trying to distance themselves from the Netanyahu government, but also just from the Israel regime and the actions that they've taken over the last 6 months. Where I think there's a new reality here. The question is, Elijah, are we going to be able to get to that moment where people can take a deep breath, where there's a pause, a ceasefire? Because isn't that the moment that everyone can reflect and reconfigure the reality? But as long as it stays in the emergency mode, as long as it stays in the critical mode, we can't globally cannot collectively have that moment where people can reset the situation, reset the stage. This is the big fear, is you go from one escalation to the next, you don't have even that split second that everybody could just take a breath and say, this is out of control. We need to hit the brakes now. I'm afraid that we're not going to get this opportunity. We might just have this steady stream of crises back to back. How do you see this playing out in the next 6 months?
I think if Iran retaliates and hit Israel, and the Americans stop the retaliation of the Israelis on the Iranian retaliation, I think that will be a strong hit that the Americans will direct to Benjamin Netanyahu, and Biden will get his revenge, because that will contribute further to the fall of Netanyahu domestically and will make him look weak if the Americans put pressure on Netanyahu not to retaliate to the Iranian retaliation of the destruction of the Israeli consulate. If this happened in this scenario, then it is more plausible to go to a permanent ceasefire. So the problem today is the negotiation to the ceasefire is when Netanyahu is holding two cards in his hand. So in the morning, he allows the negotiation team that is led by the Mossad director and the Shin Bet director, the Shabak director, the internal security, and he gives them the authority to negotiate, and then he phoned them up once they are in Cairo or in Doha, retracting 2 points that are permanent ceasefire and the withdrawal of all the army from the cities of Gaza, because the negotiation is divided into 3 steps. The first step is the release of 40 Israeli hostages and prisoners. And the difference is there will be civilians, there will be sick people, and there will be female reservists. On the first stage, there will be an exchange between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The number is irrelevant because this is where both sides can agree easily. The only point today where the Israelis decided to pull out from the cities, we're not talking about pulling out from Gaza, not even the resistance is asking of the Israelis to pull out completely from Gaza in the first stage. So they want guarantee that in the first stage, the Israeli will pull out of all the city, which they have done, at the exception of the Netzarim corridor that divide Gaza from the east to the west into a 500, 600 meters wide and 6 to 6.5 kilometers long. And it reached the sea to the east of Gaza. And this corridor is controlled by the Nahal division that is preventing the return of the Palestinians. And this is the second point. The Palestinians want the return of all the people who left the north back to their homes. And the Israelis are saying, well, we can allow the return of 2,000 only, or we can allow the return of the children up to certain age and to elderly, or we can allow the return of a certain number of people, but we need to check them. So the difference here is a permanent, not lasting ceasefire, because the lasting means the negotiation can fail later on in another stage and they can regain the hostility. And the second point is the pullout of the Israelis from all the cities, including the Netzarim corridor. And this is where the Israelis are not accepting to meet these conditions, because that means the end of the military operation. Because although the Israeli will remain on the outskirts of Gaza, inside Gaza, that's okay by the resistance, because in phase 2 and phase 3, they will obtain the full withdrawal of the Israelis as long as there is an international guarantee by countries who will agree on the deal. And this is where everything is stuck. Now, the Israelis have pulled out of most of the cities. And this is a step that is a voluntary move that the Israelis have taken. They have allowed an increase, but not sufficient, number of humanitarian aid into the south, but not in the north. They promised they will open the Eretz crossing in the north, and they will use the Ashdod harbor to transport more support to the Palestinian in the north. And the last 2 points of the Eretz crossing and Ashdod harbor was not implemented yet, but at the end of the day, Benjamin Netanyahu will have to do it. Therefore, he is already giving concession before the negotiation. And this allowed the resistance to say, okay, we have two demands. Apart from increasing the humanitarian aid, you allow all the Palestinians to return to the north, and you pull out from all the cities as a first step. And if Netanyahu does that, it means the end of the political career, because the far-right members of his government, he is also far-right, but the more far-right than the Likud party, are threatening him. You pull out of Gaza, we pull out of the coalition, and then the government will fall. And then everybody would go to an early election, and Netanyahu will not be elected, because today, instead of enjoying 35 votes in the Knesset, it's Benny Gantz who has 35 votes, and Netanyahu has 18 only. So he knows he's going to fail in any early election. This is why he's caught. He wants to save his neck, and this is why he's trying to go somewhere where he can stay for a longer war by fighting against Iran, or by triggering Hezbollah to respond in a more wider way, so he can start a war on Lebanon and say, oh, we can't go to an early election in the middle of the war. This is the first time in the history of Israel where there are demands of new election in the midst of a war, because people want Netanyahu to step down because he has failed in his objectives, according to the Israeli opinion. And on top of this, it's a Haaretz newspaper that is voicing it, apart from the Brigadier General, former Brigadier General Benny Gantz, Ehud Olmert, all the Syrian Israeli current and former officials agree that Netanyahu failed in his objectives.
I think from the international pressure that could be put to bear on Israel, obviously sanctions being hugely symbolic. If there were major countries or some countries putting significant sanctions, or some kind of a joint effort like there was against apartheid South Africa, or even something even less than that, but something that's significant. Because I think the problem here is there's not enough signals from the international community to sort of outright, on the record, condemn the state of Israel for what it's undertaken over the last 6 months. And I think this is the international dimension is really important. Everything that you're saying internally, I can totally see this playing out as well. The United States would love to back Benny Gantz and then sell him to the American public and the world as a moderate alternative. But isn't the debate in Israel, they've gone past where they were before. The liberals in Israel are arguing with the hard right between ethnic cleansing and genocide, basically. I mean, this is how far Israeli society has been pushed to the right as a whole. I don't think internally they can turn back. It's almost like they've taken a direction that there is no turning around. They're totally invested in what we're seeing now. They're seeing northern Gaza as a parking lot and celebrating this as some great strategic or objective for the future security of the state of Israel. So absent of international pressure, Elijah, is there any way to restrain the Israelis in what they're attempting to do? And it's pretty clear what they're attempting to do is to empty out Gaza. What are your thoughts?
So I think Israel has a critical crisis today, by all means. And I will start with something very simple. Israel claimed to be a state that doesn't behave as a state, because a state, first of all, has a constitution, has a defined border, and has a law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, doesn't have a border, and doesn't want to define its law because it is shifting according to the will of a prime minister whose power is overpowering the justice system. And this is why many Israelis left before the 7th of October, because they're not living in what so-called country they were promised to live. Secondly, Israel said that this is a democratic country, but then it says that we are a country only for the Jew. So which one is it? Is it a democratic country or a country for the Jew? It is neither nor, because not all Jews support Israel, and many Jews around the world are against the Israelis. So point 3, Israel Zionism state 2 main points. First, the return of all the Jews to the land of the promised land of Palestine. Now, there are millions of Jews outside Israel who don't want to return. So how someone outside Israel can claim to be Zionist and not return to Israel? Now, let's suppose that this is not an obligation according to the Zionist doctrine, which I agree. It is one of the points, but not an obligation. But the second obligation of Zionism is democracy. Now, have we seen any democracy in Israel? Between the Israelis, this is not a democracy when you abolish the justice system and you take over and say any decision by the Supreme Court should go to the Knesset and not to the justice system. This is not democracy. Are you living in a democratic country where leaders call other people animals? Do you live in a country where it is an apartheid regime and you call it democracy? So it has nothing of democracy. So the notion of state is not there. The defining the definition of state is not there. The title of a state that is for the Jew is not a state for all the people living there, because there are Israeli non-Jews. So what do you do with these? The third point is neither all the Jews want to return, nor they live in a state of democracy. And the fourth point is the only thing that the army of Israel is doing is to kill other civilians and to randomly, indiscriminately kill the people who are living in Palestine, the original people of the country. And here we're talking about not only the Arab Palestinian, we're talking about the Jew and the Christian Palestinians. We're talking about the Jew Orthodox who threatened to leave Israel because the Israeli government want them to take part of the army. So even the Orthodox Israeli who are against Zionism, they reject the state of Israel. They don't consider Israel as a state, and they don't want to join the army and threaten to leave because they don't believe in the land they have occupied. So everything in Israel is in question. And then we're dealing with leaders who wants to cut water, electricity, kill civilians, consider women and children as terrorists needs to be killed. I mean, there is nothing that leads us to believe that Israel is a state. It is a regroupment of gangs with a lot of power, with a terrorist army terrorizing the population, with a destructive means that come from America, Germany, and rest of the world supporting what the Israeli army is doing, with a failure, total failure of this army that we can count 450,000 between the reservists and the professionals, and they are incapable of taking 364 square kilometers, where all the American military officials are laughing about this army that they have financed, and they thought this is an American base in the Middle East where they don't need to have a military base, although they have 2 military bases in Israel, and they have a strategic warehouse of their ammunition in Israel, but they thought Israel is kind of the United States of America. Well, I don't think the Americans would like to identify themselves with an apartheid regime, with a state that claimed to be to hold up democracy, and it's using terror against its own people by eliminating justice system. It's an apartheid regime killing the Israelis indiscriminately because it has the impunity by the United States, and it always needs the United States to protect it. Doesn't have a border. The Likud Party 1977 charter said the limit of Israel is from the sea to the river. So this is what the Israelis think. They need to expand, and they say we don't have a constitution until all the Jews around the world will return, which is never. The Jew around the world will never return. So millions of Jews are saying, we're happy where we are. We don't need to go back to Palestine or to Israel. Why 750,000 left Israel during the after the 7th of October? They left back home because their home is not Israel. Their home is somewhere else. And because the government failed to protect them, they came because the government said it can protect them. The army failed to protect them. They are disappointed because the army did not protect them on the 7th of October. They cannot return to the northern border, the northern Lebanese borders. Why? Because the army cannot protect them. So this entity is standing on sand. There are no foundation for it by the same Israelis and by their actions.
So all these myths, all these assumptions, the Middle East only democracy, that's been completely shattered, as you've very eloquently laid out in your description of it and its dire state. Israel as this undefeatable, impregnable military force, that's completely been shattered. Israeli intelligence is omnipotent, all-knowing, and the best in the world. That's been shattered as well. And on top of that, as you've just laid out, basically a failed European colonial settler state project. History will have to look at it in that way, because there's no other way to look at it. I know amidst the high point, you could say the apogee of the state of Israel, probably in the 2000s, but now we're heading in a different direction. It's clearly trending downward on so many different levels and rapidly, that it can only be described as a failed colonial settler, a European colonial settler project in the Middle East. It clearly doesn't belong there. There's an autoimmune reaction which is occurring not just in the Middle East but globally against this colonial project. So how will history remember Israel as a fourth crusade that didn't work once again? What do you think?
Well, I think Israel will always be remembered as a child killer entity that killed more than 35,000 Palestinians in a few months and destroyed 70 to 80% of the houses in Gaza, including hospitals, schools, universities, the entire infrastructure, but did not hesitate to film all their atrocity and put them on social media. This is what the world will remember, how the Israeli challenged the whole world. They've challenged the international community, international laws. They mock the International Court of Justice. They mock the International Criminal Court. They are mocking the United Nations. They call the United Nations anti-Semite, but they stay in it because only the Secretary General is saying that this war did not start on the 7th of October, but 50 years ago. But I think Israel, the world should be grateful for Israel because we have seen, thanks to Israel, the level of crime and atrocity the Israelis are capable of committing. And they have the audacity to put it on films and show it to the whole world. And I think we all should be grateful for Israel that raised, thanks to its crime against humanity, war crime and genocide, the awareness of the population, the curiosity of people to learn more about the injustice of the Palestinian people that suffers since 1920, 1930, since the first arrival of the Haganah and the Stern Gang terrorist groups that were made by Zionists, considered by the British as terrorist organization, and who started to kill Arabs, British, and even Jew. Ishaq Shamir, the former Prime Minister of Israel, killed even Jew just because of his objective and ideology. This, we are extremely grateful for Israel to have given the opportunity for people in the back of beyond to be interested in the injustice they are committing against the Palestinians. And one sentence I never forget, when the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, came out in a press conference and said, the Palestinians are animals. We're going to kill them all. We're going to cut water, electricity, and food, and do not lecture us. That was, in only one sentence, he told the world the whole history of what the Palestinians have suffered by the hand of these people who are the sons of their ancestors, the terrorist groups that landed in Palestine in 1920, 1930, where the British in 1917 gave them part of Palestine to live in, as long as they live in harmony with the local population. The British colonialists gave them a piece of land that doesn't belong to the British, but belong to the Palestinians. And then today, the British and the international community are supporting them. And we have to be again grateful for Israel, who even helped us even further to expose the hypocrisy and the double standard of the international community that can no longer hide it, and they can brag about it overtly, and they can no longer lecture any country in the world where the South, like South Africa, like Nicaragua, stood for the right and the value of human being much more than America, than France, than Germany, and the United Kingdom and United States.
You know, it's been made clear. The veil has been lifted as a result of this unfortunate series of events, that the latest phase of hostilities that were begun on October 7th, Elijah, and I agree, and many would agree with you, of course, that it's opened the eyes of a lot of people in a way that no amount of explanation and, charting the history and the timelines and the details, just a few of these statements by Israeli officials, like the defense minister, you said, speak volumes, speak thousands of words, in fact. And it's unfortunate that it's come to this, but this is where it's at. And I think the outpouring of support for the Palestinian cause globally, that's sustained over the last 6 months. Nobody could have seen this coming. You couldn't get an anti-war movement to sustain for this period of time and globally, and it has, and it's grown, in fact, in support of this very small piece of land in the Middle East and these people known as the Palestinians. So we're hoping for a good result, or some kind of negotiated pause, some armistice, some settlement, an end to the killing. We're all going to have to pray and hope for the best in this case, but I fear that this may only be the beginning, unfortunately, Elijah. So, but we really appreciate you joining us here on the Sunday Wire and giving us your thoughts, your observations, and your feelings on this historic and biblical, dare I say, biblical series of events that we're looking at right now. But really appreciate it. Elijah Magnier, author, journalist, longtime Middle East correspondent. Appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire this week.
Thank you for having me.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. And you can follow Elijah's work on social media. He also has an amazing blog site as well. And do look for his work, his books, his articles, and follow him. He's also a regular on X, formerly known as Twitter Spaces. He offers his time and his commentary on that platform as well. So this is another place where you can see the work of Elijah Magnier. We're going to take a break right now with the Sunday Wire and the Alternate Current Radio Network.